I hear it, that flinch in your chest, the one you feel every time someone says, "Fear the Lord." You love God. You've spent years trying to walk close to Him, and still, this word sits there, wrong somehow, like a stone you can't swallow or spit out. Maybe you felt guilty for not being afraid enough in prayer. Maybe you felt a quiet resentment you've never said out loud for a faith that seems to ask you to love someone while bracing yourself against them. You've tried to explain it away. You've tried to just accept the discomfort as the cost of faith. Neither one has brought you peace. So what if the flinch isn't the problem? What if what you were taught fear meant was never what the word meant at all? There is a word that has followed you your whole life inside the walls of faith, and every time it surfaces, something in you tightens. You hear it in a sermon, read it in a verse, hear it quoted by someone older and more certain than you feel. And before your mind can even process the sentence, your body has already responded. A small contraction somewhere behind the ribs, a flicker of unease you've learned not to name out loud. The word is fear. Fear the Lord. And if you are honest, achingly honest, in the quiet place where no one else can hear your thoughts, you have never known quite what to do with that phrase. You love God. You have built your life in ways large and small around trying to know Him, trying to walk close to Him, trying to trust Him, even when trusting felt like standing on ground that kept shifting beneath your feet. And yet, this one instruction, repeated across Scripture with such weight and frequency that it cannot be ignored or explained away, leaves you feeling something you don't quite want to admit. A flinch, a recoil, a quiet, uncomfortable distance from the very God you are trying to draw near to. Maybe you were taught, somewhere along the way, that this fear meant something close to terror. Maybe the image handed to you was of a God who watches closely for failure, who keeps some kind of ledger, who is patient but only to a point, who loves you but might also, in some way you were never quite able to picture clearly, be dangerous to you. And so a strange fracture formed inside your faith, a love for God sitting right next to a wariness of Him. The two never quite reconciled, both true at the same time, in a way that never fully made sense. You have perhaps felt guilty for not being afraid enough, as though your peace in prayer was somehow a failure of reverence. Or you have felt a quiet resentment, buried so deep you rarely let yourself look at it directly, toward a faith that seems to ask you to love someone while also bracing yourself against them. Both of these responses come from the same wound, the sense that something about this word was never explained to you rightly, and so it has sat there for years, unresolved, adding one more layer of unease to a heart that already carries so much. Because this is not the only thing you are anxious about. If you are like most people who find themselves here, listening to these words, turning this question over quietly in your mind, you are already carrying more than enough. You lie awake some nights, running through decisions you're not sure you made correctly. You wonder if you are doing this whole life right, this whole faith right, second-guessing choices about work, about relationships, about the direction your life seems to be moving in, or failing to move in. Your mind rarely rests. It circles back to the same worries, rehearses the same conversations, imagines the same worst outcomes, searching for some kind of control it can never quite grasp. And into this already overworked, already anxious mind comes one more misunderstood command: fear the Lord, landing not as comfort, but as another small weight pressing down on a heart that was already struggling to breathe freely. This is the quiet, invisible battle so many believers carry and almost no one talks about. Not a dramatic crisis of faith, not a public unraveling, but a slow, private confusion that sits underneath everything else. A nagging sense that maybe you don't understand God as well as you thought you did, that maybe there is a version of Him you have not yet met, and that the distance you feel is somehow your fault. You examine your own heart and wonder why intimacy with God still feels, in certain moments, edged with caution. You wonder why prayer sometimes feels less like coming home and more like walking carefully into a room where you're not entirely sure of your welcome. And underneath all of it is a single question you may never have said aloud, but that has shaped more of your spiritual life than you realize. What does it actually mean to fear God? And why does it feel so different from everything else I know to be true about Him? Here is what makes this ache so persistent. You already sense, somewhere beneath the confusion, that something doesn't add up. The God you have encountered in the quiet moments, in answered prayers, in the strange peace that sometimes arrives uninvited in the middle of hard seasons, does not feel like a God who wants you cowering. And yet the word remains undeniable. woven through Scripture from beginning to end, spoken not as a suggestion, but as the beginning of wisdom itself. So the tension holds, a God who is good, and a command to fear him, and no clear bridge yet built between the two. You have likely tried to resolve this on your own, perhaps by minimizing the word, deciding it must mean something softer than it sounds, or by accepting the discomfort as simply part of what faith requires, a kind of holy unease you're meant to carry without question. Neither of these has actually brought peace. They have only helped you tolerate the tension a little longer. But what if the discomfort itself has been misdiagnosed? What if the flinch you feel is not a sign that something is wrong with your faith, but a sign that something was never explained to you the way it was meant to be understood? What if this word, so heavy with associations of dread and distance, was never meant to make you smaller or more afraid, but was pointing all along towards something you have been quietly longing for without knowing its name, something that does not shrink your relationship with God, but deepens it, something that does not add to your anxiety, but, rightly understood, might be the very thing that begins to dismantle it. This is where we begin, not with more information stacked on top of confusion, but with a willingness to set down the picture you inherited and look with fresh eyes at what fearing the Lord was actually meant to mean. Because the truth waiting on the other side of this question is not smaller than what you believed. It is larger, and it may be the very thing your anxious, overthinking heart has been needing all along. To understand why this word has caused so much quiet confusion, it helps to look honestly at where the picture came from, not to assign blame to anyone in particular, but simply to see the shape of it clearly. Most of us did not arrive at our understanding of fear the Lord through careful study. We arrived at it the way we arrive at most of our early spiritual impressions, through tone of voice, through the posture of the adults around us when the subject of God's holiness came up, through half-formed associations absorbed long before we had the capacity to question them. A phrase spoken sternly in childhood carries a different weight than the same phrase spoken with wonder. And so, for many, the word fear was quietly filed away in the same category as other fears we knew instinctively. The fear of getting in trouble, the fear of disappointing someone whose approval we depended on, the fear of consequences we couldn't fully predict but knew to avoid. Once fear of God was placed in that category, everything that followed made a strange kind of sense. Of course, prayer would feel cautious. Of course, closeness would feel risky. You had unknowingly filed the creator of the universe under the same heading as everything else that had ever made you flinch. This raises the question that has likely sat underneath your discomfort for a long time, even if you've never phrased it quite this way. Why would Scripture use a word like fear at all, if that isn't what it means? Why not choose a gentler word, something that couldn't be misread this way? It's a fair question, and it deserves more than a quick dismissal. The answer begins to unfold when you consider what the word was pointing to in its original context. Not self-protection from harm, not the bracing tension of anticipating punishment, but something closer to the mind's collision with a reality too vast to hold casually. Think for a moment of standing at the edge of something enormous, not something that threatens you, but something that simply exceeds you, the scale of it, the way it makes your usual categories feel too small. That sensation, the mind reaching for something it cannot fully contain, is closer to what this fear was always meant to describe. Not the fear of a threat, but the fear of an encounter. Awe in its most literal, full-bodied sense. This is the first real shift, and it's worth letting it settle rather than rushing past it. If fear of the Lord was never primarily about self-protection, then the entire emotional architecture you built around this word needs to be reconsidered. It was never meant to make you flinch away. It was meant to make you look up. And yet, here is where the tension remains, because insight alone does not erase years of ingrained response. You may still feel that old caution rising in prayer, that same instinct to hold something back, to approach carefully, to keep a small emotional distance, just in case. This is worth naming honestly, rather than judging yourself for. Old patterns do not dissolve the moment new information arrives. Your mind has practiced a certain posture toward God for years, sometimes decades, and it will take more than a single realization to fully unlearn it. But something has shifted already, even if it doesn't feel like it yet. You now know the discomfort was never a sign of spiritual failure. It was a sign of a picture that was incomplete. Consider, too, how this incomplete picture has quietly shaped more than just your prayer life. It has shaped how you relate to your own mistakes, how quickly you assume distance from God after a hard season, how much energy you spend trying to manage his opinion of you the way you might manage the opinion of someone whose approval always feels slightly out of reach. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains something important about the anxious, overthinking mind so many carry into their faith. When the foundational relationship, the one meant to anchor every other relationship, every other fear, every other uncertainty, is itself built on a subtle current of unease, it makes sense that everything downstream would carry a similar current. You cannot build deep security on a foundation you're quietly unsure of. And so, the fatigue you feel, the sense of having to constantly monitor whether you're doing faith correctly, may not be a personal failing at all. It may simply be the natural result of trying to rest on ground you were never sure would hold you. Here is where a small but significant seed begins to take root, one that the rest of this journey will continue to unfold. If the fear Scripture describes is not about danger, but about magnitude, if it is the appropriate human response to encountering something genuinely holy, genuinely vast, genuinely other than us, then it was never designed to distance you from God. It was designed to orient you correctly toward Him. A small view of something enormous will always produce either indifference or dread, because the mind hasn't yet grasped what it's actually standing before. But a right-sized view, one that lets the vastness be vast, without translating that vastness into threat, produces something entirely different. It produces reverence that draws you closer rather than reverence that pushes you away. This is the direction this understanding is moving toward, though we are not there yet. For now, it is enough to notice this. The discomfort you've carried was real, but it was pointing to a misunderstanding, not a warning. The unease was never the truth about who God is. It was the echo of an incomplete picture, formed early, carried long, and finally, here, now, being gently set down so that a truer one can take its place. Let's stay with this a little longer, because the shift we're describing deserves more than a passing thought. It deserves to be understood clearly enough that it can actually change how you approach God, not just how you think about Him in theory. Fear of the Lord, as Scripture presents it, is reverence. It is awe. It is the settled recognition of standing before something holy, something vast, something entirely good, and feeling the full weight of that goodness rather than shrinking from it. This is not the fear of a threat. It is the fear of significance. And once you begin to see the difference, it becomes hard to unsee. Think of moments in your own life, even outside of faith, when you have stood before something too large to casually process. Perhaps you have stood at the edge of the ocean at night, the water stretching out farther than your eyes could measure, and felt something rise in your chest. It wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite comfort, something closer to reverence. Perhaps you have looked up at a clear night sky, far from city light, and felt suddenly, almost physically, how small your daily worries were against the scale of what you were seeing. Perhaps you have held a newborn child, felt the improbable weight of a new life in your hands, and felt something tremble in you that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with wonder. In each of these moments, your mind was doing something important. It was recognizing scale. It was recognizing that it stood before something greater than itself, something it could not fully explain or contain. And instead of running from that recognition, something in you leaned into it. That leaning, that trembling wonder, is far closer to what Scripture means by the fear of the Lord than anything resembling dread. This is the loop worth sitting with now. If this fear is not about being afraid of punishment, why does it still feel so serious? Why does Scripture treat it with such weight, calling it the beginning of wisdom, the foundation of understanding? The answer is this: seriousness and safety were never opposites. You can tremble before something and be entirely unthreatened by it at the same time. A heart can be moved to its depths by wonder without that wonder carrying any hint of danger. Think again of the ocean, the night sky, the newborn child. Each of these moments felt significant, weighty, even overwhelming, and yet none of them required you to be afraid for your safety. The seriousness came from the size of what you were encountering, not from any sense that it wished you harm. This is exactly the posture Scripture is inviting you into, not a casual, offhand relationship with God, treated the same as any comfortable routine, but not a fearful, guarded one either. Something steadier than both, a reverence that takes God seriously precisely because it has finally stopped needing to be afraid of him. This reframing has a practical effect that's worth naming plainly because it touches something you likely wrestle with often without realizing its root. Much of what feels like prayer for many believers has quietly become a kind of performance, an attempt to say the right words, to strike the right tone, to prove sincerity or devotion in a way that will be received favorably. This happens almost invisibly, especially for those whose minds tend toward overthinking. If God has been, even subtly, filed under the category of someone whose approval must be carefully managed, then prayer will naturally start to feel like an audition rather than a conversation. You may notice this in yourself, a tendency to rehearse your prayers before speaking them, a quiet anxiety about whether you're praying correctly, a sense that certain requests are too small or too selfish to bring honestly before God. This is not communion. This is performance dressed in spiritual language, and it is exhausting in exactly the way performance always is, because it never lets you rest. But watch what happens when reverence, real, awe-filled reverence, replaces that anxious performance. When you begin to see God rightly, not as someone whose approval must be earned through careful words, but as someone so vast, so holy, so entirely good, that his goodness itself becomes the safest place you could possibly bring your unfiltered self. Prayer changes shape. It stops being a performance evaluated by an audience and starts becoming what it was always meant to be, an act of communion with someone worth being fully honest with. This is where the practical application of this whole reframing begins to take root in daily life. It starts small. It starts with noticing the next time you pray, whether you are performing or communing. It starts with allowing your prayers to be less polished and more true. It starts with letting the weight of who God is do what it was always meant to do, not press you down into anxious carefulness, but lift your eyes up and out of the smallness of self-monitoring altogether. There is something worth naming clearly here, because it touches the very core of your identity in this relationship. You are not on trial before God. You have likely lived in ways subtle and unspoken, as though you were, as though every prayer, every decision, every moment of doubt was being quietly evaluated, weighed, filed away as evidence for or against you. But this is not the posture Scripture is describing when it speaks of fearing the Lord. You are not standing before a judge waiting to see if you measure up. You are standing before something so much larger than judgment that judgment becomes almost the wrong category entirely. You are standing before holiness itself, and holiness, rightly understood, is not an accusation. It is an invitation to finally, fully, without pretense, see God as He actually is. This is the ground we are building toward, not a smaller, safer version of God shrunk down to fit your comfort, but a rightly sized reverence that, instead of pushing you away, becomes the very thing that lets you draw near. There is a paradox sitting at the very center of everything we've explored so far, and once you see it clearly, it begins to explain far more than just your discomfort with a single word. The paradox is this: rightly ordered fear of God does not multiply fear in your life. It dismantles it. The very reverence that once felt like it added weight to an already anxious heart is, in truth, the thing capable of lifting weight off of you in every other area of life. This sounds almost too simple to be true, especially if you have spent years carrying a low hum of anxiety about the future, about your decisions, about whether things will hold together the way you need them to. But stay with this a little longer, because the logic beneath it is worth understanding fully. Consider why smaller fears grow so loud in a life where God has quietly been shrunk down to a manageable, distant figure. Someone acknowledged on Sundays, referenced in difficult moments, but not truly experienced as vast, present, and near. When that happens, and it happens gradually, almost without notice, something has to fill the space that God's true size was meant to occupy. And so, everything else grows larger to compensate. Your job security becomes larger, the opinions of others become larger, the uncertainty of tomorrow becomes larger. Your own ability to control outcomes becomes, in your mind, disproportionately important. Because if God has been reduced to a background presence rather than the central reality He actually is, then you are left holding the weight of your life almost entirely on your own. This is exhausting in a way that rarely gets named clearly because it doesn't look like unbelief from the outside. It looks like diligence, responsibility, care, but underneath it is often simply this: a heart trying to carry alone what it was never designed to carry alone because its picture of God has grown too small to trust with the weight. This is where the practical shift begins to take real shape, and it's worth asking the question directly. What actually changes when reverence replaces dread? It begins with a reordering of proportion. When God is rightly seen as vast, holy, unshakably good, and genuinely near, the things that once felt overwhelming begin to resize themselves in your mind, not because the circumstances themselves have changed, but because the frame around them has. A difficult financial season is still difficult, but it no longer has to carry the full weight of your security, because your security was never meant to rest on your own management of circumstances in the first place. A hard decision is still hard, but it doesn't require the same anxious rehearsal, because you are no longer navigating it entirely alone, trying to guess correctly under pressure. This is not a promise that circumstances become easy. It is something quieter and, in many ways, more durable. A promise that you were never meant to hold their weight by yourself. Here is a micro-revelation worth letting settle deeply, because it may explain something you've puzzled over for years without quite naming it. Much of the anxious overthinking you battle, the late-night replaying of conversations, the compulsive planning for outcomes that may never happen, the constant low-grade vigilance about whether things are going to be okay, may not be at its root simply a personality trait or a stress response. It may be a symptom of misplaced weight. When too little awe has been given to God, too much fear gets distributed to everything else, because the mind is always looking for something large enough to organize itself around. And if it hasn't found that in God, it will find substitutes, however inadequate they are for the task. This does not mean your anxiety is a moral failure, or that a shift in theology alone will erase a lifetime of ingrained patterns. But it does mean the direction of healing is real and available. As reverence for God grows rightly, the disproportionate fear given to lesser things has somewhere to go. It can finally rest. This reordering touches something tender, so it's worth pausing here rather than moving past it too quickly. If you have spent years feeling like your anxiety was somehow evidence of weak faith, this reframing offers something gentler and more accurate. Your anxiety was never proof that you didn't trust God enough in some vague, general sense. It may simply have been proof that the picture of God available to your mind, day to day, in the actual texture of your decisions and worries, was smaller than the God who actually exists. That is not a failure to be ashamed of. It is a gap to be closed, slowly, gently, through exactly the kind of reorientation we are walking through now. And there is real relief in that distinction. The relief of realizing the goal was never to try harder at not being afraid, but to see God more truly and let the seeing itself do the quiet work of loosening fear's grip. There is still an ache here worth acknowledging honestly, because transformation like this rarely arrives all at once. The old habits of overthinking, of bracing, of quietly managing your own life as though no one larger were holding it with you, will not dissolve simply because a new idea has been understood. This is where patience matters. Not patience with God, but patience with your own mind as it slowly relearns a pattern it has practiced for a very long time. What is changing, even now, is the foundation beneath that pattern. You are no longer carrying the weight of your fears toward a God who feels distant or uncertain inside. You are beginning to carry them toward a God whose vastness, once feared for the wrong reasons, is becoming the very thing your anxious heart has needed all along. Something large enough, finally, to actually hold what you've been holding alone. There is a question that naturally rises once you begin to grasp the true scale of who God is, and it deserves a careful, honest answer, because otherwise this whole reframing risks feeling incomplete. If God is this vast, this holy, this entirely other than us in majesty and power, how can prayer still feel personal? How can something so large also be someone you can speak to in the quiet, ordinary moments of an ordinary day, while making coffee, while driving, while lying awake turning a worry over in your mind? This is not a small question, and it deserves more than a quick reassurance. It deserves to be walked through slowly, because the answer touches the very heart of what reverence was always meant to produce. Here is where the picture completes itself in a way that may surprise you. Holiness, rightly understood, was never meant to function as a wall keeping you at a distance. It was always meant to be the very ground that makes closeness safe. Think about what it actually means to trust someone deeply, not casually, not conditionally, but deeply, with the parts of yourself you don't show many people. That kind of trust is rarely built with someone unpredictable, someone whose character shifts, someone whose goodness cannot be relied upon. It is built with someone whose integrity is so complete, so unwavering, that you can bring your full weight to them without fear of being dropped. This is precisely what holiness means when applied to God. Not a distant purity that recoils from your mess, but a completeness of goodness so total that it becomes the safest possible place to bring your unfiltered self. The very holiness that once felt like it created distance is rightly understood. The thing that makes intimacy trustworthy rather than risky. Picture for a moment what it might feel like to approach something holy, not with the tightness of dread, but with the trembling gratitude of being genuinely welcomed rather than merely tolerated. This is a subtle but important distinction, and it's worth sitting with directly. Many people who carry the old, distorted picture of fearing God live without quite realizing it, as though they are tolerated by Him, allowed into His presence on the condition of good behavior, careful words, sufficient effort. But this is not the picture Scripture paints of reverent fear. Reverence does not approach cautiously, bracing for rejection. Reverence approaches with a kind of overwhelmed gladness, the gladness of someone who cannot quite believe they are actually welcome in a place this holy, and yet finds again and again that they are. This is worth letting resonate, because it may be unfamiliar to a heart that has spent years quietly managing its own worthiness before God. You were never meant to earn your way into that welcome. The welcome was always the starting point, not the reward for getting close enough to deserve it. This has real practical weight for how your daily life with God can begin to look and feel different. Consider what it might mean to bring a decision to God, not as an anxious request for approval, hoping you've phrased it correctly enough to receive a good answer, but as an act of worshipful trust, laying the decision honestly before someone whose goodness you have come to actually believe in, rather than someone whose reaction you are still quietly trying to predict and manage. Consider what it might mean to pray about your fears for the future, not as a performance meant to demonstrate sufficient faith, but as simple honesty spoken to someone vast enough to hold what frightens you without being destabilized by it. This is the shift reverence makes possible, not less seriousness in your relationship with God, but far less anxiety, because the seriousness now flows from awe rather than uncertainty. And yet, here, something honest needs to be said, because transformation like this is rarely linear. Even as this clarity begins to settle, old guilt may resurface, a flicker of the former unease, a moment where the new picture feels too good to be fully trusted, where some quiet voice suggests that surely there must still be some distance to maintain, some caution still required. This is worth naming rather than ignoring, because it is a normal part of unlearning something deeply practiced. The old framework does not disappear the moment a truer one is understood intellectually. It fades slowly, often unevenly, sometimes resurfacing in quiet moments before settling for good. If you notice that flicker of old guilt rising even now, let it be met gently rather than believed uncritically. It is not evidence that the old picture was right. It is simply the residue of a pattern that is not yet fully caught up with what your heart and mind are beginning to understand more truly. What is emerging here, slowly and steadily, is the full shape of what this whole journey has been moving toward. The fear you once resented, the word that made you flinch, was never meant to keep you at arm's length from God. It was meant all along to lead you into exactly this kind of nearness, a nearness built not on managing your own worthiness, but on trusting the complete, unwavering goodness of the one you are drawing close to. Reverence and intimacy were never opposing forces pulling you in different directions. They were always meant to move together, awe deepening closeness rather than preventing it. This is the ground you are now standing on, even if it still feels new, even if old caution occasionally still whispers otherwise. And it is on this ground that the final, full realization is about to come into clear view. There is a moment in every real transformation where scattered pieces suddenly arrange themselves into a single, clear picture. And this is that moment. Everything we have walked through together, the flinch you've carried for years, the guilt over not feeling frightened enough, the quiet resentment toward a faith that seemed to demand distance, the slow unfolding of reverence as awe rather than dread, the discovery that holiness makes closeness safe rather than dangerous. All of it has been building toward a single realization, and it is this: the fear you resented was never designed to make you small. It was designed to make God large enough to trust with everything you are afraid of. Sit with that for a moment, because it reorders the entire framework you began this journey with. Go back briefly to where you started. The discomfort, the sense that something about your faith required flinching, the suspicion that maybe you were failing at something everyone else seemed to understand more easily. Notice now how each piece of that original tension traces back to the same root cause. The guilt you carried was rooted in a miscalibration. You believed the size of God's holiness was meant to shrink you into fearful smallness, when in truth, it was meant to expand your capacity to trust. The distance you felt in prayer was rooted in the same miscalibration. You believed nearness had to be earned through careful performance, when in truth, nearness was the starting point, offered freely to a heart willing to approach with honest reverence rather than anxious caution. The resentment you buried was rooted in the same misunderstanding. You believed reverence was a demand that diminished you, when in truth, it was an invitation that was meant to enlarge your whole understanding of what safety with God could feel like. This is the reversal worth naming plainly, because it is the hinge this entire message turns on. Your view of your own size was inflated by anxiety, and your view of God's size was diminished by an incomplete picture. And the two together produced exactly the tension you've carried for so long, a heart trying to manage what felt too large for it, standing before a God who seemed too small to fully trust with the weight. What reverence does, rightly understood, is correct both distortions at once. It shrinks the exaggerated sense that everything depends on you, your carefulness, your performance, your ability to get faith right, and it restores the true, expansive sense of who God actually is, vast enough, holy enough, good enough to be trusted with the very things that once felt unbearable to carry alone. Here is the micro-revelation that completes this turning point, and it's worth letting it land fully rather than rushing past it. Awe was never the opposite of intimacy. It was always the doorway to it. This may sound contradictory at first, especially if you spent years assuming reverence and closeness pulled you in opposite directions, one requiring distance and the other requiring familiarity. But think back to every image we've walked through together: the ocean, the night sky, the vastness that draws you in rather than pushing you away. Awe, real awe, does not create separation. It creates connection with something worth being connected to. You do not walk away from the ocean's edge feeling smaller and more distant from the world. You walk away feeling, in some quiet way, more alive, more aware, more connected to something larger than your daily concerns. This is precisely what reverent fear of God was always meant to produce. Not distance, but a doorway into the kind of closeness that only becomes possible once you have rightly seen the one you are drawing near to. Notice, too, how this reframes the anxiety you carry in nearly every other area of your life. Because this was never only about one theological word, it was about the foundation beneath everything else. If God has been rightly seen, vast, holy, trustworthy, near, then the disproportionate fear you've given to circumstances, to decisions, to the uncertainty of tomorrow, finally has a true resting place to be redirected toward. You are not being asked to simply try harder at not being anxious. You are being invited to let your fear find its proper object, the one place large enough, faithful enough, unshakable enough to actually hold it. This is not a small shift. It touches every anxious thought that has ever kept you awake, every overthought decision, every quiet fear about whether things will hold together. All of it was always meant to be brought here, not managed alone, but handed to someone whose greatness was never meant to threaten you, only to finally give your fears somewhere true to rest. Something has settled now that was unsettled before. The tension you carried into this video, the flinch, the guilt, the buried resentment, has not disappeared through force or effort, but through understanding rightly what was true all along. You have not been asked to feel less. You have been invited to see more clearly, and in seeing more clearly, something in you is finally able to exhale. The old fear misunderstood for so long has done its final work, not by frightening you into distance, but by leading you patiently all the way to this threshold of trust. What remains now is simply to step through it and let this new understanding settle into the ordinary rhythms of your daily life with God. Here, at last, is the fullness of what this whole journey has been leading toward, and it deserves to be said clearly, simply, without any remaining shadow of the confusion you carried into this video. To fear the Lord is not to live braced for harm from someone unpredictable. It is to stand, awake and undefended, before the one being in all existence who is entirely trustworthy, and to let that recognition reorder everything else in your life around its rightful center. This is not a fear that shrinks you. It is a fear that finally lets you see accurately, perhaps for the first time, both how small your anxieties truly are and how vast the God is who has always been near enough to hold them. Trace the arc of what has shifted across this time together. You began with guilt. Guilt for not feeling frightened the way you thought you were supposed to. Guilt that quietly suggested something was wrong with your faith. That guilt has given way to gratitude, because you now understand that what you were missing was never the terror you tried to manufacture, but the awe you were always meant to receive as a gift. You began with distance, a subtle, persistent sense that closeness with God had to be earned through careful performance, that prayer was an audition rather than a homecoming. That distance has given way to closeness, because you now understand that holiness was never a wall keeping you out, but the very ground that makes nearness safe. You began with dread, a low hum of unease attached to God's name, a flinch buried so deep you rarely let yourself examine it. That dread has given way to trust, because you now understand that the fear Scripture speaks of was never about being afraid of God, but about finally seeing Him large enough to be worth trusting with everything. This shift reaches far beyond how you feel about a single word. It reaches into every anxious thought you carry about the future, every overthought decision replayed at night, every quiet fear about whether your life is unfolding the way it should. Because when reverence for God grows in its rightful place, something remarkable happens to the disproportionate fear you've given everything else. It begins, slowly and honestly, to loosen its grip, not because your circumstances have suddenly become certain, but because you are no longer facing that uncertainty with a God who feels small, distant, or uncertain himself. You are facing it with a God vast enough to be trusted, patient enough to walk with you through the unresolved, and good enough that his nearness does not need to be earned, only received. This is the central truth worth carrying with you long after this video ends. Rightly understood, fear of God does not create distance. It creates trust. The very thing you once resented, the phrase that made you flinch, was never meant to push you away from the God you love. It was meant to lead you, patiently and gently, into a closeness with Him that only becomes possible once He is seen rightly. Holy, yes, but not distant. Serious, yes, but not dangerous. Vast, beyond measure, and entirely, unshakably good. Let this settle into the ordinary places of your life. Let it meet you the next time anxious thoughts begin circling in the quiet hours, reminding you that the one you are bringing them to is not someone to brace against, but someone large enough to hold them fully. Let it meet you in prayer, softening performance into honest communion, replacing careful words with the kind of unfiltered trust that only grows in the presence of someone truly safe. You do not have to carry the weight you've been carrying alone. You never did. The fear that once felt like a burden was always quietly an invitation. And now, perhaps for the first time, you are free to accept it as one. If this word has met you in a place you needed it today, consider staying close to this channel, where truths like this one are unpacked slowly, honestly, and always with the aim of drawing you nearer to who God actually is. Like this video if it spoke to something real in you. Leave a comment if there's a piece of this you want to sit with a little longer, and subscribe if you'd like to keep walking through these questions together. Wherever you are right now, whatever quiet fear you brought into this video with you, may you leave it a little lighter than you arrived. Not because the fear was wrong to bring, but because you now know exactly where it was always meant to rest.